When I was a younger Christian, I used to think it was pretty obvious who was like a good Christian and who wasn't. Who's in and who's out. Probably would have made the Pharisees proud, except the whole me being a Gentile thing. But after decades of teaching high schoolers and working in churches, I realized it's not that obvious, actually. I've had students I would have bet would have followed Jesus forever. But after only a few years, they were long gone, wanted nothing to do with Jesus or Christianity. And then I had other students who I never would have expected to become serious Christians. I wasn't even sure they were even listening when I was talking in class. And some of them are now serving in ministry or on the mission field. So it taught me a lesson that I needed to learn, and I actually think a lot of my Christian brothers and sisters need to learn this lesson as well. And it's that we are not nearly as good at identifying weeds and wheat as we think we are. And this is apparently a lesson that Jesus' disciples and his first century audience needed to learn as well, because he addresses exactly that in one of his most misunderstood parables, the parable of the weeds and the wheat. We can find the parable in Matthew chapter 13, and it says this, starting in verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." So until harvest time, the farmer intentionally leaves the weeds and the wheat together, which is pretty bad farming advice. And I think Jesus is doing it on purpose to get our attention about something. Most of the time, Jesus doesn't seem to be very interested in explaining what he means by his parables, except when his disciples corner him and ask him, which happens 6 verses later. It says that the disciples went into the house with Jesus and they said, "Hey, can you explain the parable of the weeds and the wheat to us, please?" And this is what he says in verse 37. "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear." So Jesus tells the parable. He explains the parable. Case closed, right? Wrong. This is actually where the interpretation debate gets kind of fun. You see, even though Jesus explains all of the component parts of the parable, scholars in different camps think that he's doing different things with his explanation. But no matter the take, I think you're going to notice that there's a common factor in each of these interpretive angles. The most traditional angle is that Jesus is being straightforward in his interpretation. He means exactly what he is saying. He's talking about a final judgment in the end times, and this is how it's going to go down. The good and the bad are going to get sorted out. Kingdom people and devil people will get divided. Some will be burned and some will shine. The partial preterist position says that he's talking about something that was going to go down in the first century, that it's a critique on some of the misguided factions in first century Judaism, like the violent zealots and some of the more hypocritical judgmental elements of the Pharisees. And there's going to be a first century judgment that weeds out these different elements, sort of finding its first century climax at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Or parable commentator Farrar Capone, who actually thinks Jesus is being ironic in his explanation to the disciples. He essentially tells a parable about how the good and the evil are all mixed together in the world, but his disciples are so fixated on, "Yeah, but can you explain the meaning to me?" And so with a sort of wink to the audience, Jesus says, "Okay, you want to see judgment and condemnation and then glorification for the good guys? How about this? Well, this is who this is who that is, and then some are going to get burned and some are going to get into the barn, and it's going to be a great old time for the good guys and a bad time for the bad guys." And he ends with that iconic line, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear," which essentially is a call to attention for any reader, any of his listeners, to pay attention. There's more going on here than just these little elements and whatever superficial interpretation you think is going on. And so whether it's about the end times or a call to check yourself in your immediate historical context or an ironic sucker punch to tell you to stop being so worried about who the good guys and bad guys are, Jesus is calling us to pay attention because there's more going on here. Which brings us to the nature of these weeds we're talking about. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned some unexpected outcomes with students that I assumed would do great, and then just a few years later, they end up walking away from their faith completely, seemingly to not return, at least not till this point. And then there were other students who, frankly, I was pretty concerned about. They were already kind of off the deep end, and I was wondering how much deeper they could get just in the few years after high school. But then those students surprisingly end up going to seminary or getting into ministry and actually becoming amazing human beings that follow Jesus with all their hearts. And there's a reality in this parable that Jesus is actually pointing to that speaks to that. And it's the comparison between wheat and this specific weed that Jesus is talking about. Many scholars think that the plant being talked about is this toxic plant called Darnel. And if Darnel gets mixed in with wheat, it can actually do bad things to the wheat crop because of some things that can grow on the Darnel that make it toxic to humans. And the thing about this toxic weed is that except to the trained eye, it looks almost identical to wheat until it is fully mature. A cursory glance at a field filled with Darnel and wheat looks just like a field of the same crop. And by no means am I a wheat farmer, but I have experienced something similar to this in my own poorly maintained backyard. This part of my backyard underneath this tangerine tree is often subject to great neglect, as is evidenced by the weeds behind me. I'll get on it when the video's over. Don't judge me. That's literally what the parable's about. Spoilers. But a few years back, I had a lemongrass plant growing here in this mess. I love a good lemongrass stir fry, or you can use it in a tom yum soup. But the thing about lemongrass is it looks like grass, and when you have an area of the yard that is filled with grassy weeds, the lemongrass looks like just another one of those grassy weeds. And I had asked a gardener friend to come help me out with my backyard to get rid of some weeds. And it was a really busy season of life, and so I didn't specify exactly what was and wasn't a weed, and so he came into this area and he hit the whole zone with Roundup. He did a good job of avoiding the apple tree and the tangerine tree, and back then I had some tomatoes and other things growing in this area, but in less than a week's time, that lemongrass plant was dead. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, then it all looks like a bunch of weeds. Or maybe it all just looks like lemongrass. And maybe this is why the landowner in Jesus' parable says you have to wait until harvest time. You have to wait until the difference between the weeds and the wheat is 100% clear. And when it's time to sort it all out, you need someone who's completely qualified to say what is a good plant and what is a weed. What is wheat and what is Darnel? Because some things only become obvious with time. And you see, that's the thing, is the sorting is going to happen. Evil doesn't get to keep doing its thing forever. And good will be recognized as being good. So even though the weeds and the wheat might look the same for a while, eventually at harvest time, when things are fully matured, we'll see who is the weeds and who is the wheat. But there's something so important in Jesus' interpretation of this passage that I think is the thing that we need to hold on to and change our minds about. And for me, maybe it's because there are parts in Scripture where we are called servants of God. But in this particular parable, we, the human beings who are Jesus followers, are not the servants. Jesus says that the servants are the angels, and the master is God. And so if you are a follower of Jesus, you know who you are in this parable? The angels are doing the sorting. God is overseeing the harvest. Your job in this parable is to be wheat. You'll notice that the wheat isn't told to complain about the weeds around it. The wheat isn't told to uproot the bad plants in its proximity. The wheat isn't told to judge weeds or even to call the shot on who is and is not wheat. That job is for the servants and the master, the angels and God. And so if you are not an angel or you are not God, it is not your job to say who is and is not wheat. You see, Jesus is brilliant here. He's not saying that it doesn't matter who's a weed or who's wheat. Yeah, that obviously does matter. It matters if you're doing the things that the enemy wants to do or if you're doing the things that the king wants you to do and you're part of his kingdom. But the point of this parable for you is that you are not called to be chief weed inspector. You are called to be wheat, to have deep roots, to bear fruit, to multiply, to be faithful and fruitful and patient, being the best dang wheat you can be this side of eternity. And we can trust the sorting to God. Let's go be good wheat.